Hi, I'm Ashley Gordon.
And I'm Kirk Kernut, and welcome to Reading for the Rest of Us.
Grassroots reading talk show.
And today's episode is?
It is about sense of place, setting. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing sense of place?
Well, we were talking one day about books that we loved that just really evoked a landscape or a cityscape or an environment that wasn't our everyday panorama of Dunkin' Donuts and Walmarts and all of that fun stuff that we live in. And we just sort of came to an agreement, I think, that a lot of books that we both love are about a setting, that are about a place. So we thought we'd explore some of the reasons that is and what some of the appeal of place is. When you read a book that's about a place, what's your main attraction to it?
So started thinking about it, as you said, so we were talking, I thought, well, why is that? Am I drawn to this particular place and books set there? I think sometimes I do it because it's a place I'm going and I want to understand more about the people. Sometimes it's a place I've been and I really enjoyed being there and I want to go back and don't have the airfare. I think as well it's an opportunity to just escape. So, you know, just as you said, to avoid, not so much to avoid, but to experience something completely different. Yeah. Not necessarily where I've been, where I'm going, but just the other. Take ourselves out of where we are. I think it's the easiest armchair traveling you can do.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. Ernest Hemingway had this theory about how he had to go to Paris to be able to write about northern Michigan, and he said there's this idea that you had to, called it transplanting. It's like a plant. You know, you have to take it out of its native soil and put it somewhere else. And I think in some ways reading is an opportunity for us to do that, where we can imaginatively take ourselves out of our native soil and go to these other places, and because the reality is most places you read about you're never going to get to. If you're lucky, you may.
Right, I've been reading about Italy for years. It's still hadn't quite.
And the other thing is, if you do ever get to them, chances are you're going to experience them more as a tourist than actually as a, you know, as a traveler, shall we say? That might seem like a
or inhabitant.
Inhabitant, yeah. You really, in some ways, I think when we go to different places, we always carry where we come from with us. And I think reading in some ways allows us to see that part of ourselves, that native part of ourselves, and maybe shed it for a little bit to get to a more imaginative setting. It's interesting because reading is, for setting is also one of the major appeals of novels outside of literature, outside of reading, because they do become tourist booms. I mean, we're in the state of Alabama where one of the biggest tourist sites is
Monroeville.
Exactly.
Yep, I pass the exit every time I come up here to do this.
Exactly. And we go there and we see what? We see the courthouse and we see...
Well, and we also export the same that same place, because just in the last week there was a troupe that performed To Kill a Mockingbird in Japan.
Right.
I think so. Yep. So not only is it a tourism draw like Savannah with
Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil.
Thank you, Midnight. So not only do you create a tourism industry around the literature, but I think you can export yourself to some degree, and then make people interested in who you are, what your place is, through the literature.
Right. You know, I think a lot of the descriptions of sites, the description of cuisine, the description of the drinks, it all sort of projects for us a lifestyle. Now, there is a danger to that, and I think we ought to talk about it a little bit or just acknowledge it. There's a sort of phenomenon out there, I think, in books that are about traveling to foreign settings. There's a tendency to sort of make super exotic the destinations, and a lot of travel literature, I think, has struggled with treating people fairly, or not objectifying the locals or the local customs. There's even something, and I would probably get us kicked off the air for using this term, but there's even something in...
I plead innocence completely. I have no idea what he's about to say.
It's called travel porn, and what it is, believe it or not,
you just said that.
And it is. It's a term that's used for both books and movies that I think sort of glamorize places super visually as sort of exciting, exotic destinations where we as Americans or we as Westerners can shed our inhibitions and go nutso.
Well, since you say that, one of the first books I read to prepare for this, actually, that's exactly what that place was for the. So okay, back up. When I went to research Sense of Place, I thought, okay, well, I'll go to my standard textbook so that we have a reference book. So it's E.M. Forster and his aspects of the novel. And it's just a wonderful explanation of all of the pieces that make up a novel. And so I went to look up Sense of Place, and lo and behold, it's not there. And I thought, well, that's really odd, because one of my favorite all-time books is Room with the View, which he wrote and which is very much about place. And it's basically set in Italy and Edwardian England. And Italy, for the English of the time, they saw Italy as this, and he presents it very much in the novel, as this place of passion and freedom and self-expression. And the Italians themselves, which sort of also alludes to what you were talking about, the Italians are somehow more primitive and more genuine. And so Lucy Honeychurch, while she's there, the main character, she adopts a lot of that, or she at least comes in contact with it.
Right.
George is already that way, and then when the story reverts back to England, everybody kind of closes in on themselves, and all of the rules come crashing down. And then the story is about trying to reconcile that freedom with her everyday life, and you know, to varying degrees of success. So way back then, already exotic places were being presented in literature as maybe more than what they could live up to,
right.
but certainly the grass was looking greener on the other side.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think that really is the biggest danger of reading for a setting. You picked a couple books, and I have to admit a little bit of ignorance, because I have not read these, but tell us a little bit about the.
Oh, I love this book.
Tell us a little bit about where it's set and what you love about this.
So this is one of two books. The Hummingbird's Daughter was the first. I'm not sure if you have the cover.
Yeah,
the
I've got
Queen
the
of
other
America.
one.
Okay, that's the follow-up. And I'm probably going to mangle the name, Luis Alberto Urrea. And so he had in his family a legend of an aunt who was a saint in Mexico. She was considered the saint of the people, Saint of Cabrera, and had heard about it his whole life, so he researched it for 20 years. So it's two books, but really the first one, The Hummingbird's Daughter, is the one that really sort of catches your breath. And in his case, in that first book, there is a good deal of magical realism, because she's a healer and she's able to perform these miracles, but he completely transports you to Mexico at a time of political upheaval. So part of his research was about the church, the politics, the military of Mexico at the time, so he could make it as authentic as possible, as well as researching his aunt, who was in a lot of newspaper stories at the time, and she really did exist. And so he was able to take something that was real, but because it was so distant from him, and because she was specific, but she was a legend essentially in her own time in the best possible way. So there was a fable to it. The fiction that he weaves around it, he's a wonderful writer. And Mexico, this was not a book I read because I was planning to go to Mexico.
Right.
Can't even remember how I stumbled upon it, but it made Mexico and its culture of the time so real to me. And then with the second book, Arizona, California, early 1900s, the American West and its relationship to Mexico at the time. So the politics were fascinating, and sometimes what these books will do is sort of open you up to a subject you didn't even know you were interested in, a place in the world or a point in history that I didn't know I was interested in until I read these books, and then you read more. Umberto Eco does that too.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember reading Foucault's Pendulum, and suddenly ended up with 10 books on the Templars, because they give you a little tidbit of something, and if they're good, they immerse you into that place and that time, and then you just need to know more.
Yeah. I think that's one of the fun things of reading these books that are set in these very specific locations, whether they're at a specific historical moment or not, is that they teach you so much about the local customs.
But it doesn't feel like school.
Right, right.
Yeah, and it's learning about people through story.
Yeah.
And you think of like Uncle Remus and legends that we grew up with, and the oral history of, you know, like Beowulf. You know, we have as human beings, not to get too heavy, but we define ourselves through our stories, and we have through the course of history. And so I think by reading the story of these people, you have a better understanding of who they are, where your similarities are, where you might have diverged, and to some degree, why. Yeah. Now, in this case, it's just a beautiful book, and it's a lot of fun to read, and you don't have to do any of that heavy learning stuff if you don't want to.
Yeah.
But as you say, it happens while you're reading, and you kind of don't even know it's happening.
You might think of it as there are novels about going abroad where the main character is the American who is observing the foreign, quote unquote, the foreign customs. But then these, you know, we have this whole other book, and these are much more contemporary types of books that are about the actual people there. So the Americans are not necessarily the perspective, and
no, this isn't. It's innocence abroad, is what I'm thinking.
Right, right,
you know, but I think the publishing industry, the book industry, has evolved to the point where there's a lot more literature and translation than there used to be, and a lot of what I read for Sense of Place is actually written originally in Spanish or Italian or another language, and I do think a little bit is lost in translation often, but I think we're quite blessed in that we are becoming more and more aware of writers who aren't American, and they aren't even thinking about us when they're right. So it really is that foreign sensibility is a part of it. But then again, with the E.M. Forster, it's very, very English, and it's very, very familiar.
I wanted to talk about a book real quick that I've been in love with for about 23 years. And it really made me love the place, and I go there a couple times a year to do research because I'm interested in it. But I picked up a book about Key West, and you know, there are all kinds of novels set in Key West.
Yeah.
Key West to me is a very interesting sort of American setting because it's the end of America. It's Mile Zero, which is the name of this book. But it's really one of those borders, and I think this is one of the types of place novels that are very interesting because you get this whole sort of, you know, interweaving of different cultures, and the Key West novels not always do that. Probably the most famous one is Ernest Hemingway's To Have and Have Not, which is quite honestly a bad book. But
it's a great movie.
Yeah, and it's set nowhere near Key West either. That's the funny thing about that. But Mile Zero, Thomas Sanchez, he was really not one of the first ones to do novels. He didn't get down there until the early 80s. So there'd been already a string of 70s novels, but they were kind of burnout, hippie type ones. Jimmy Buffett and Thomas McGuane had a whole group down there that, you know, really did do a lot of acid and tequila.
Happy hippie.
At the same time. What I love about this book is, first of all, it's very tropical. I mean, I don't care. I can go outside in 20-degree weather and start reading this. And
Isn't that amazing? I feel the same way about Gabriel Garcia Marquez novels. I mean, they come with humidity.
Yeah, yeah. And the style tends to be very cramped in a sense. It makes you feel that humidity. It makes you feel that stuffiness.
The closeness, the heaviness of the air.
Exactly.
Yeah, we know all about that down here.
That's part of what makes it very vibrant, though, and it's kind of fun. I think there are a lot of people that would have problems with this book because, you know, when it does have a reputation somewhat for being overwritten, which I think is kind of unfair. But one of the things I really love about it is the way that it really is the first Key West novel by a quote-unquote American writer to bring in the Cuban history and sort of the Native American background of it. There's a wonderful moment where there's a sort of flashback to the cigar factories of the turn of the century, and you really get a sense of how differently the history of this place has evolved over time. I think if you're, if you're at all a Miami Vice type thriller guy, it's a great book because it's about the beginnings of the cocaine trade in the early 80s. But it has this whole other notion of Key West as a metaphor for America, and Key West as the end, sort of the end of the American dream, and where things are sort of rapidly spiraling out of control.
So I haven't read it, but this is making me want to read it. But a lot of what you're saying sounds like what I've read in other Caribbean literature, but particularly New Orleans.
Sure.
But the difference that I'm hearing is that in New Orleans, it really isn't all that American.
Yeah.
It talks about all the layers of different cultures that have come and melded, but American is almost an afterthought.
Yeah.
Whereas this is sounding like what all of those cultures have contributed or how they've influenced, but still very American in its outlook.
Because the population there was American. I mean, they were Northerners who sort of immigrated down. I mean, you did have a population of natives that when they originally came over, they were from the Bahamas. But those old money types were really outnumbered by the turn of the 20th century, and certainly by the time you get to the 40s, 50s, or 60s, when people like Tennessee Williams are down there, sort of the aftermath of Hemingway making this the place for writers to go.
Like Paris with an ocean.
Yeah, well, that's exactly
Paris
it.
with sunshine.
Hemingway called it the Saint-Tropez of the poor, which I thought was is a great description. But that's it's interesting how I think a book makes you fall in love with a place.
Yeah.
And it's to the point with me with this novel now. I've had a couple of research projects on Hemingway that have made me go down there, but I've wanted to research Sanchez's writing of this novel, and so I find myself going down there now and mapping out the little locations and taking my little Instagram pictures of various
places
lanes.
Where he actually wrote, or places that he wrote about?
Well, places that he wrote about, places in the novel. And I think that's one of the things that these novels about settings do, is they set scenes in very specific restaurants sometimes, or in very specific sites. I happened to be in Portland in August, and we were just sort of rambling along the street, some friends of mine, and somebody said, "Oh, that's the hotel from 50 Shades of Grey." So, of course, we did not get a room. I just want to make that clear. But you know, it's
interesting. Work that book in here somewhere, didn't we?
Well, you know. But I think it's interesting how this sense of place just kind of jumps out at you. You know, even Montgomery, we joke about the city sometimes being dead, but I can go down to Oakwood Cemetery, and then I can go to my office and dig out the Saturday Evening Post with the F. Scott Fitzgerald story that was set in Oakwood Cemetery, and it has an illustration by a guy who never stepped foot in Montgomery, Alabama, and he rendered just from Fitzgerald's description an almost perfect rendering of what the entryway to that would have looked like in 1920. Wow. So I think that's sort of evoking the place. And
this reminds me kind of what we talked about with Jane Austen, episode 1, the fan fiction.
Yeah.
That putting yourself in the story, particularly when stories are set in modern times, or at least within sort of recent history, that you could go to the place where the characters had dinner. Yeah. That you feel yourself a part of the book in some way. I think that's true even, I think if I do ever make it to Italy, that Room with a View, and at this point I'm not really sure how much is book and how much is movie, because I've seen it a lot, read it a lot, and now they kind of are mushed together. But I do think I will carry that story, however it's conveyed, with me when I go.
Right. I agree totally. I'm fascinated by the phenomenon of literary tourism, where people plan their vacations or they go do things that are related to novels. And the girl with the dragon tattoo has started a whole sort of industry up in that area. Where you can get a package tour and go see. Oh, this is the.
Well, and it's not as if this is terribly recent, because in London there have been Shakespeare walking tours for a long time.
I think it gives you a sense of. I think being in the place where these books are set sometimes can give you a sense of the in a weird way, it allows you to live in the story even more.
Yeah,
that,
and
if
you're
any
reading
sense.
to some degree to either learn about the place or escape to the place, then actually, maybe it just lends a little romance or.
I think romance is a perfect word for it. I did want to mention one of the drawbacks, and it's not so much a drawback associated with the book, but it's associated with the way I think we think of the books. Because especially in American literature, there's a tendency to think of big novels as cosmopolitan, as being set in New York or L.A.
Yeah, I think that's particular. We've talked about this,
Yeah.
and I would second the argument that it's particularly American.
Right, right. It doesn't happen a lot in. Although if you read Madame Bovary, you know, part of the whole drama of that is the girl from the provinces coming to the big city and being sort of seduced into decadence. But when I started about 25 years ago, I was trying to.
You're really aging yourself in
I
this
am,
episode.
I know. But I was. There's no hope of pretending otherwise at this stage. But I started reading a lot of books off the sort of the beaten path of New York, Boston, especially in 19th century. And I ran into a writer named Sarah Orne Jewett, who's most famous for A White Heron, which, you know, we kind of, if you teach, you probably teach that story to death. But it's interesting because she chose to write largely about Maine and about rural Maine, and she was really, I think, sort of, you know, categorized as a regionalist. And that's what happens to a lot of people when you start writing about a very specific place or region. The South is a sort of, in a sense, a category that a lot of writers have been, you know, locked into. It becomes a way of not universalizing the themes or the settings in the book, and I think it's really unfair to these writers in a lot of ways. This particular book, Country of Pointed Firs, is a short story sequence, but it's really a wonderful look at sort of the 19th century folkways of small villages in this period of time, and what it teaches you is that in a period in which the predominant sort of writing was about the city and all notions of what America was about.
Yeah, I'm hearing a gender bias here, actually, in what you're
there
talking
is.
about.
That's tied into it very much as well. You know, her biggest sort of obstacle to recognition were guys like William Dean Howells and Henry James, who were convinced that, you know, for literature to have a capital L, it had to take on sort of the class structure, and it had to be epic, and it had to be.
So when was this?
Oh, this is 1890s,
Okay.
1896 or so. Really.
So do you think
lovely.
that's still true then?
I
She was
do.
regionalized at the time.
Yeah.
But are we still doing it?
I think in some ways we do. I mean, I think if you think of the shipping news or books like that, part of the way they become popular is because they give you an insight into that peculiar eccentricity of a place.
Yeah, but I don't know that that's a bad. I'm not sure people look on that as a bad thing.
Yeah.
And I
Well-
think in the South, well, I guess what I would say is you can either work against it or you can go with it
Yeah.
and use it. And like for Southerners, and we really hadn't talked about Southern literature at all, partly because
We kind of avoided that.
we kind of have, because it's done a lot,
Yeah.
and we all kind of know it, and we're trying to go a little further afield, but we eventually will have to.
Yeah.
But part of, I think, what Southern literature has done is kind of, there's that joke about in the South how we don't hide our eccentric relatives in the closet. We put them out on the front porch and hand them a drink.
Yeah.
Again, that's probably my family. So I wonder if in the South and in Southern fiction, and maybe in what you're terming regional fiction, there is an otherness to it. There's
Yeah.
a foreignness to it. But in some cases, I think we have a sense of pride.
Yeah.
We are different.
Yeah.
This isn't just McDonald's all across the country.
I think it's a notion of degrees, I think. I mean, there's a point where I think you just get exasperated in Southern literature with the Tobacco Road sort of image of, you know, of everybody just being dirt poor and being, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah,
you
we all
know,
beat each other up
yeah,
and
killing
incest
killing your neighbor's
well,
mule
I think to
and
some
everything.
degree Tennessee Williams and William Faulkner sort of set the
Yeah,
tone.
exactly.
And everybody's been kind of...
Not everybody in the South is a grotesque, and in the same way, not
Flannery
everybody
O'Connor,
in
yeah.
not everybody in rural Maine is
and amazing how we're getting way off what we thought we'd talk about.
That's all right.
Amazing how some of that sticks. Like,
Yeah.
as a Southerner, when you leave the South, and it almost feels like you have to remind people that we all wear shoes. I mean, how successful some literature of place can become in setting the image in people's minds, particularly when that literature is exported, like we talked about earlier.
Right.
And I don't think that's unique to Southerners at all.
No, 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 no. One of the other things we wanted to discuss is you know, it's interesting, you can almost break down books about setting and places you've been and places you haven't been.
Yeah.
And I've been sort of excited to hear about your upcoming trip to Haiti,
Yes,
which
me
you
too.
are prepping for
I am.
by reading novels about Haiti.
Right, novels and nonfiction.
Right.
Doing both. But like we were saying before, when you talk about story of a people, that often can help you understand them. And Haiti particularly is such a complex and really heartbreaking place. And so I've been very careful that I don't want to go down there as the person with the answers. I'm just going to try to help and work with kids. And it's all about books, which is so fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
But trying to understand where they come from and what's happened. So this is actually the first Isabel Allende novel I've ever read, which is kind of surprising to me that I've not read her before. And there was, in the reviews of this and some of the other books I read for this part, the same thing you said about the Key West novel. There's a little bit of overwriting. It becomes a little florid. I wonder if that happens when you're completely steeped as an author in a sense of place, if you can't help it.
Yeah.
And I think maybe to you when you're writing about it and you're there, because almost every single one of the authors for this group of books that I read lived in the place, worked in the place, had some real personal connection to it that drew them to it. So I wonder if they lose their ability to filter that florid writing.
I think what happens is you're in the place and you're so eager to get it right and to be accurate.
Maybe you try a little too hard.
It's almost like the steam of the place comes up and opens up your verbal pores, and all these words, you start sweating all these words.
Ew.
You know. But I'd much rather read a book that is
overwritten than underwritten.
Yeah, that is thick like that than you know. I remember reading Henderson the Rain King by Saul Bellow years ago and trying to teach it, and never been to Africa, and there's no sense of Africa in the book, so it's a kind of a
Isn't that bizarre?
Yeah.
How you can read a book set in a foreign place? Because actually in this one, so the book is set in Haiti, Cuba, and New Orleans, and you get an incredibly intense understanding of Haiti and New Orleans. But even though that they're in Cuba, you don't really get any Cuba.
Yeah.
So it makes me wonder if because she did a lot of research for this book.
Yeah.
I also found that to be very common among these writers. And so there was a lot about the Haitian Revolution. There were real people interwoven with the fictional characters. And I think that hamstrung her just a bit, having to make this 40-year story pick up all these important points. It was like she was hitting an outline. Oh, gotta have that one. But we didn't get any Cuba, which I found really weird when literally you're sort of hearing the voodoo drums and so there's something that has to happen with the author, and interesting to read it in the same book.
Yeah.
There's got to be a spark for them to be able to convey it, and maybe that is where that overwriting, that florid writing comes from, because they are trying so hard.
Yep. Well, we're down to 1 minute, but
Oh,
I did
already?
want to already.
Oh my
but
gosh!
I did want to recommend one more book or one more genre, and I'd probably lose my job if I didn't do this. But books set in Paris. You gotta love.
Yes.
In the aftermath of Midnight in Paris, everybody goes to Paris. I want to recommend Jean Rhys as opposed to Hemingway or Fitzgerald. Wrote a lovely series of books, and Quartet is a wonderful sort of gothic look at Paris in the 20s. So if you haven't read that and you're more interested in that history, that's what I recommend. I can't believe we're out of time.
We're done.
We could have
I
gone,
hope people watching feel the same way.
We could have gone an hour on this one. Thank you again for watching. We want to thank our crew. We want to remind you about the Alabama Book Festival this coming April. And we also would like to say adieu by saying, read a good book. Thank you.
Thanks.